If you like audiobooks or audio shows, check out a free trial of Audible. Just click the link in the description.
Welcome to MINDSHOCK True Crime. You're listening to the Stephen Avery series. This is episode 25, Burden of Proof. Now, this episode is dedicated to all the guilters out there who are not friends and family of law enforcement and state officials that have alleged that Stephen Avery murdered Teresa Hallback. And even though none of the evidence actually stands up to any logical scrutiny, the guilters maintain that the investigation and the trial were all on the up and up. It's really bizarre. As I constantly point out, this is like a common sense test for adults. But I just wanted to do this quick episode to the guilters out there and discuss logically the very nature of burden of proof and guilt. And then in the next episodes, I'll get back to the technical details of the case. As always, if you enjoy the podcast, you can donate to our PayPal. Just check the link in the description. Make sure you subscribe to the channel, hit the bell for notifications. Make sure you allow your device to have those notifications come through. If you like this podcast, hit the like button, share it across social media platforms. Keep up the awareness, because that is pretty much all we can do at this point. The world will know. And hopefully, Stephen Avery, Brendan Dassey, they can get some kind of comfort at knowing that this level of exposing corruption might help a lot of people in the future and prevent them from being framed and cut down on these wrongful convictions and the long wait periods for exonerations. What is the average? 17, 18 years, something like that. Kathleen Zellner has a lot of experience in overturning these wrongful convictions and exonerating innocent people. And also, wrongful conviction doesn't mean he's innocent. That means that the conviction did not follow the law, even if the individual was guilty. You could also check us out on social media, Twitter, Reddit, Patreon, Facebook. And any questions, comments, thoughts, theories, suggestions, rebuttals, debunkings, leave them in the comment section. So let's get into it. Just a quick criticism of the guilters out there, the coincidence theorists, those who just do not like logic. So they hypocritically accuse people that watch Making a Murderer, oh, you watched a biased documentary and you think he's innocent? Whereas they watched things Making a Murderer left out and were instantly convinced. They were that gullible, and they didn't look up any of the easy to find, easy to debunk debunkings of what Making a Murderer left out. So I actually agree that Making a Murderer is a very biased documentary because it only showed roughly 1% of just the extreme corruption of Manitowoc and other jurisdictions within Wisconsin. So even the whole cat fire incident, there's still guilters bringing that up. I mean, if the case against Hallback is so airtight, why would one need to bring up something that happened decades ago? It just doesn't really, I mean, it's basically irrelevant to their point. However, it is relevant to truth and how Manitowoc works, because Stephen Avery wasn't even the one who threw the cat in the fire. I don't know why everybody wants to sweep this under the rug. Jerry Yanda admitted in a police statement that he physically picked up the cat and threw it in the fire. Now, Stephen Avery admits to being present, and he said he was involved in the incident, and he obviously, I mean, all of a sudden, everybody trusts Stephen Avery. It's really weird. The illogical, cognitive dissonant, coincidence theorist guilters, all of a sudden, they trust Stephen Avery when it comes to who threw the cat in the fire. Now, whether Stephen Avery is trustworthy or not is irrelevant. People that are blackout drunk might not have the best of memories. Now, clearly he felt guilty. You could see in all these other instances where he was guilty, he completely admitted to it. Whereas he was willing to stay in prison his entire life rather than get out of prison by confessing to the Penny Berenson assault, which of course he didn't do. And again, the guilters want to sweep that under the rug. They just want to bury their head in the sand and not look at any kind of logic at all. No logic and reason allowed in a guilter's mind. It's really, really bizarre. Because if this guy was willing to spend his entire life in prison rather than say he did something he didn't do, what does that tell you? It's really bizarre how those that think he's guilty don't want to think about that. So, yes, he did admit to throwing the cat in the fire, but again, why are we believing the words of humans, of any humans? That's not scientific proof, is not the words of humans. That's religious faith-based. Like, are you going to treat them like a priest and they're just preaching gospel truth? It doesn't matter what people say. Otherwise, everybody would be in jail. Everybody would be in prison because there's someone saying something about somebody. Now, this is the United States. The laws require evidence. They require guilt proven beyond a reasonable doubt, not within a reasonable doubt, not within a ballpark, but beyond. I mean, do guilters not know what the word beyond means? Do they not know what the word reasonable means? Do they not know what the word doubt means? Because again, if they're not just friends and family members of corrupt law enforcement, just backing their friends and family just to back them out of some kind of duty or, that actually reminds me of a quote from this Bruce Willis movie, The Last Boy Scout. I believe it was that movie, which stated, maybe it was a Clint Eastwood. I think it was that movie where they stated, loyalty above all else except honor. So loyalty is very important to family and friends, of course, but is honor, integrity, truth, and justice more important than loyalty? Otherwise, like, what happens if your family member is a serial killer who's killing hundreds of people? You're not going to do anything about it? It's just, there should be, I mean, I don't know, everybody's got their viewpoints on that, but loyalty should not necessarily be unconditional or unbound. So anyway, so with all these things, Yanda admitted to it. How does Manitowoc operate? They changed the police report and just put they threw the cat in the fire. So they just circled Yanda in with Avery. Yanda gets off scot-free, Avery does the time for the crime. Now, again, let's use just a little bit of basic logic and reason here. If this had happened anywhere other than Manitowoc or in non-corrupt jurisdictions, how would this be handled? Like, let's say Yanda threw a human in a fire. If Avery put gasoline on a human, that's terrible. So that is a crime, but it's not the same crime as murder. It's not even close. Especially obviously teenagers or people in their early 20s, not necessarily the brightest or most logical group of people, especially not while drunk. Now, I personally know people in incidents who have been joking around with each other and doused each other with gasoline. Obviously, nobody got set on fire. That would be criminal. But even splashing gasoline on people, obviously that's not cool. You could constitute that as some kind of a crime, but it's not the same thing as murder. I mean, what planet are these guilters living on? So Avery apparently puts gasoline on the cat. Obviously, these are all blackout drunk people. We don't really know what happened. But Yanda picks up the cat, throws it in the fire. This was the 1982 incident. And it's just really bizarre because through all this revisionist history and biased documentaries like Making a Murder, that they left out so much information exonerating Avery and casting extreme shade on Manitowoc County, on Manitowoc, and state officials. I mean, that's one of the main reasons I even did this MINDSHOCK podcast series on Stephen Avery, because all the corruption was there was 1% of it was exposed. I mean, it was just very little. And they left out a lot of things that can prove, even just character things like the cat fire. You can go look at Stephen Avery case. You could look at the actual police report and Yanda's statement. He clearly says he himself took the cat, threw it in the fire. Avery was there, he was drunk, and he might have played a role in this whole situation. I mean, who knows? Maybe Avery really was the one who picked up the cat and threw it in the fire. But it just seems unlikely that Yanda would lie and say he did it if he didn't. I mean, who wants more jail time? So it's just, yeah, all of these details. Obviously, guilters are not concerned with details. Guilters are not concerned with facts or logic or scientific evidence. They just want to obsess over what people said. Whether true or untrue, that seems inconsequential. So here's the main point of this podcast: burden of proof. So, and just to clear things up, I mean, some of these triggered guilters and coincidence theorists, they think that I am definitively stating that Stephen Avery is innocent. I am not. The burden of proof is always on the one making the claim. Again, the guilters want to just rewrite all the law books to turn this into some place like North Korea where evidence is not required and guilty parties should just go to prison, completely ignoring that countless innocent people would also be in prison if you're not requiring evidence. So what does beyond a reasonable doubt mean? It means you know for pretty much for damn sure. If it's not 100%, you're talking 99%, 90%. I mean, a reasonable doubt would mean you're not sure. So if there's no evidence, it's really bizarre because, and again, in the previous episode, I went over what the state alleges. It doesn't make any sense at all. This would have been thrown out in any non-corrupt jurisdiction. I mean, that's pretty obvious. I mean, you could look through all these other cases where known murderers with actual physical evidence still had their cases thrown out because protocol wasn't followed exactly. Now, I mean, they didn't even let the coroner on the scene. I mean, this case is this is going to go down as textbook corruption. I mean, regardless of whether Avery's guilty or innocent, this is textbook corruption. It was a frame job, a railroad job, again, even if he's guilty somehow. And you could be learning about this in criminology courses in law school at how obvious of corruption this is. So, back to the claims here. I'm not claiming Stephen Avery is innocent. The guilters are claiming he's guilty. The state, the prosecution, are claiming that he's guilty and he murdered Teresa Hallback, of which there's no definitive proof proving beyond a reasonable doubt that she's even dead. A DNA report whose chain of custody cannot be verified and states that Teresa Hallback cannot be excluded. Well, there's a lot of people that couldn't be excluded from that test. I mean, anywhere between tens of thousands to millions, depending on how much faith you put in the thresholds of that DNA test. Which, again, so if you haven't checked out DNA for Dummies, check out those episodes. I go over the veracity of those DNA tests. Some people just put their blind faith in it. I don't know. They're so indoctrinated into the cult of state worship. They think that all these tests are completely infallible and that officials can not only never lie or be corrupt, but they can't be mistaken either. So it's just really, really bizarre and nonsensical on the part of the guilters. But again, to reiterate, I am not stating Stephen Avery is innocent. And nobody has to prove innocence because you're not called upon to prove a negative. In the United States, the criminal justice system works a particular way. The burden of proof is on the prosecution to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that an individual is guilty of a crime. Has that been done in the Stephen Avery case? Again, the guilters have failed to bring forth any kind of logical argument or any proof that stands up to logical scrutiny that Stephen Avery murdered Teresa Hallback. It doesn't make any sense. And they completely ignore the $36 million lawsuit. It's just really bizarre. The amount of mental gymnastics a guilter has to do to continue to pretend that Stephen Avery is guilty, or at least has been proven guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. It's really bizarre. I mean, this is like a case study for coincidence theory. So again, this is 4-year-old mentality. Now, the best argument I've probably heard from a guilter is that, and this is a really horrible argument, but this is the best I could find, is that Stephen Avery thought that he would get away with it because he was feeling invincible because he had this civil lawsuit. He was going to get $36 million lawsuit. He thought that he'd be untouchable. Now, this obviously doesn't make any sense because he knows they're all corrupt, or at the very least, incredibly incompetent. So why would he trust? There's just no reason for him to trust law enforcement in any way. It's just really bizarre. But let's say Stephen Avery is some kind of a psychotic, and he's got, let's say he wanted to stick it to Manitowoc or whatever, and he was going to kill people and get off the hook. Like, let's just say he's that deranged. I mean, people point to statements, might have been jokes, might have been made up about what he said in prison or how he wanted to kill people, torture, kill people, whatever. And somehow, I guess he jumped his IQ points by a couple hundred in order to be the greatest criminal genius mastermind in the history of crime regarding the cleanup jobs. But whatever. And yet he still wasn't because of the RAV4. So, yeah. So wouldn't he wait until he got his money? That's what. Like, why would you compromise and jeopardize your payday? I mean, you could be really, really stupid and still understand that you don't jeopardize that payday. So if he got his money first, I mean, that would at least, that would be slightly more of a shred of credibility or plausibility on the side of the guilters. I mean, it still wouldn't really work because, well, the whole thing is, they also can't see the justification for a frame-up job, which is really bizarre. I mean, even if you take the $36 million lawsuit out of the equation, look at the timeline. The deposition's about to take place. I mean, can it be any more obvious? And that's another good question for the guilters. What proof would they require that this was a case of a corruption in a frame-up job? Because the pieces are all there. I mean, how much more do they require? Do they require confessions? Because let's say let's say Coburn confesses or whatever for his role. Would you believe the confession without evidence? Or is the hypocrisy play going to be in full effect? You know, humans say weird things. It's just, especially people that want to go watch WrestleMania. And if they're not a fully functioning high IQ level child like Brendan Dassey, they might think they get to go home and watch WrestleMania, so they'll tell these corrupt, mean, abrasive, berating, coercive interrogators what they want to hear. And then, of course, we don't know what was said off camera either. So, again, the guilters, they put their blind religious faith that investigators would never, under any circumstances, say something off camera or anything of that nature, make any kind of threats to friends or family, completely ignoring all these countless other false confessions. It's like false confessions are real, except in the Stephen Avery, Brendan Dassey case. In that case, they can't be real. False confessions don't exist. Corruption doesn't exist in the Stephen Avery case. Other cases maybe, but not the Stephen Avery case. I mean, do guilters realize how silly they sound? It's really bizarre. They continue to comment on MINDSHOCK videos, and of course, they continue to do the rounds with their narrative steering on various social media platforms. Now, maybe they're employed by Manitowoc or the state for whatever reason to try to drum up some kind of morale for the case to not lose any kind of public respect, even though that's gone out the window a long time ago. So, and again, of course, not releasing the RAV4, any other, not retesting the bones. Do they even have the bones? Do they even have the RAV4? Like, all of these my dog ate my homework excuses that guilters they're that gullible. It's really bizarre. If you took an average IQ of a guilter, what would you get? I mean, I'm just trying to really make sense of these narrative steers. Now, if they're all friends and family or just employed by the state, and they're not actually serious adults who really believe Stephen Avery is guilty or that it was proven beyond a reasonable doubt, that's fine. That's fine. But for this podcast, I was just appealing to the guilters out there that are not friends and family, that are not being paid to peddle a certain narrative online. They really got duped by things making a murder left out. Again, ironically and hypocritically making fun of people who think he's innocent, whereas they don't realize I mean, yeah, I'm sure there's a certain portion of people who think he's innocent because of the Making a Murder documentary. But the people that I speak to, and myself personally, what convinced me that the burden of proof was not even close to met and that it's a complete, obvious, corrupt frame up job is the actual case files, the court transcripts, the actual documents, the police reports, all these things. And of course, the history of Stephen Avery in Manitowoc. You can't just ignore. I mean, these guys framed him before. A lot of these same individuals were involved in the original frame up. I mean, can this be any more obvious? Even if there wasn't a previous frame up, a vendetta and damaged egos and a $36 million lawsuit at play, let's remove all that. It's still obvious without all that. All you have to do is spend an hour studying other wrongful convictions. And there's just certain patterns that emerge. Of course, my dog ate my homework excuses, withholding of evidence, not testing certain evidence like the fingerprints in the RAV4, just not wanting to release certain things. It's really, really bizarre how these basic patterns. I mean, I guess guilters have that low of an IQ that they can't put together these they just don't have that basic level of logical comprehension or a certain base level of cognitive function. I'm not meaning to, like, this isn't an insult. I'm making objective observations here and asking questions if that's the case. If it's not the case, and there are these genius guilters out there with these incredibly high IQs, why have they not been able to provide any kind of logical argument? All they have in their playbook is Stephen Avery threw a cat in the fire, which isn't even true, again, proving that they don't fact check anything. They just take as gospel truth on blind faith what they might see on TV. Or that Stephen Avery somehow thought that he'd be immune for whatever reason because he was framed before, so he had nothing better to do than to, as I said in the Heel Spider posted on the Making a Murder subreddit that I went over in the last podcast episode, he had nothing better to do but decide that a photographer that occasionally takes photos of his vehicles needs to be taken out of the picture. I mean, he's got a $36 million lawsuit. You don't have to be a genius to play it safe. He probably, especially knowing how corrupt the law enforcement in that area is, this guy was probably following the law to a T and doing everything he could not to get molested. He was probably using his turn signals. He was probably doing everything down to the letter of the law, because why would he chance his $36 million lawsuit? Especially, the depositions about to happen with Vogel and Kucerik, and they were close to the top of the heap. The people saying, "Oh, well, other depositions already started." Yeah, they did, of the lower level individuals. So Kucerik and Vogel, they were at the top, and they might have not been at the tipping top. We don't know, but it's really, really bizarre. So, challenge to all the guilters out there. Do you have a logical explanation supported beyond a reasonable doubt, meeting that burden of proof of how Stephen Avery could have killed Teresa Hallback, not left any evidence, that also accounts for all the obvious corruption? Using these cherry-picking logical fallacies to only address one thing, completely ignore others, of course, that's not logical. So anybody interested in logic, truth, and justice, you can't just ignore all these elephants in the room, of which there are many. You have to account for the variables. So, yeah, it's really, really bizarre. Or are guilters just that mentally weak and cognitive dissonant? They just can't believe that law enforcement or people wearing costumes, they would ever do anything illegal or of this magnitude. Now, again, we have to consider they never thought their actions would be put under this kind of a microscope, because, again, just look at the past few decades, look at all the wrongful convictions, look at all the frame-up jobs. In those cases, there's no microscope. They really thought they could get away with it. And they might have also underestimated the public interest. There's a lot of people interested in truth and justice out there who have never met Stephen Avery, Brendan Dassey, and some of them even say that Stephen Avery might be just a horrible human being, but you don't put innocent people in prison, or at least you can't put them in prison for crimes they didn't commit. Put them in prison for crimes they did commit. So you have all these things, and of course black and white fallacy is another go-to fallacy of the guilters, where they just think it's, one or the other. But again, people who just have a deep knowledge and understanding of the case seem to really, really believe that this was wrongful conviction. And the guilters are always, they actually can't ever even really name any kind of facts or details of the case, because they just watched things Making a Murderer left out briefly a while ago, and they just took it on blind faith as gospel truth due to their own cognitive biases and mental weakness. And of course, their ego, Dunning-Kruger. Of course, it's a very real thing. We cannot ignore that, because if people are too incompetent to see their own incompetence, and they're so ego dominated, they can't handle being wrong. So they're just going to dig their hole deeper regarding Stephen Avery. So it would be interesting. Now, the normal reaction of coincidence theorists, like whenever any kind of conspiracies are proven true, they just don't address on how silly and illogical they were to be gullible to fall for the official narrative. They just don't address it. They pretend it didn't happen, etc. And it's really common. Very rarely do you see humans take responsibility. And if this was a frame-up job, an extreme corrupt frame-up job, what do they expect? Do they expect all of them to admit it? Because in cases like these, there's usually one, if this is going to get blown wide open, there's one whistleblower, so to speak. One person confesses for a plea bargain, and they give up the other cops or officials. Now, how high up the chain this goes, that's what's curious, because if you have state-level officials that are complicit, and not necessarily directly complicit, again, as George Carlin once said, you don't need a formal conspiracy when interests converge. What are the converging interests here? People working at crime labs, etc., if they thought they were being told the truth by these other officers and investigators, and they went along with it, they're in a little bit murky territory, because technically they're accomplices and complicit to the frame-up job, but they didn't know it. They probably thought it was all on the up and up. Why wouldn't they? How many officials of any kind of law enforcement or government agencies are going to automatically assume that other officials or officers are corrupt and double check everything all the time, especially if they're not required to do so? Their job description is their job description. When they receive a sample, they do ABC. When something else happens, they do XYZ. They don't just immediately assume all of these investigators and police officers are lying. They do the opposite. They believe they're telling the truth. And that's how this whole thing could have unfolded, where it really could have just been a small handful of individuals that did this frame-up job. So, challenge to the guilters out there. Again, what evidence is required to prove the corruption in the frame-up job? But you're not required to prove that, because, again, the guilters just completely ignore the law of the land in the United States. You have to be proven beyond a reasonable doubt. Just because jurors were intimidated and or incompetent, or had a bone to pick with the Avery family or whoever, that doesn't mean he was proven guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. If there's no evidence, you're just putting your faith in humans. This is religious, faith-based thinking. The law is not based on religion or faith that humans aren't lying or humans aren't incompetent. That's why actual evidence is required. Again, it's really bizarre. Perhaps there really aren't any guilters out there who aren't friends and family or law enforcement, or aren't in single or double-digit IQs. But I don't know. I really don't know. That's the challenge here. Provide logical proof that he's guilty, or provide the proof or evidence required to see that there was a cover-up, frame-up job. These are the challenges to the guilters out there. And I don't know. Perhaps it's a time thing. Like, you have to put in a certain amount of time, because when I started looking into the case, even after watching Making a Murderer, it's not that I assumed he was guilty or innocent. I really didn't know. I just thought it was kind of interesting. There were certain pieces that didn't add up. So then you investigate, you research. Is it a case of guilters just being that mentally lazy that they haven't put in the time to actually read the court transcripts and the police reports, all the case files, to go through the history of Manitowoc and Stephen Avery? If they just haven't done the legwork, but they don't want to admit that they're wrong because they're that emotional, they went with their knee-jerk reaction based off either what Making a Murderer left out, or just their faith based on their indoctrination into the cult of authority or state worship. So their worldview doesn't allow for that kind of corruption on a mass scale. So they just wouldn't believe no matter what. So a lot of curiosities to ponder regarding guilters and this case, but it could be an important lesson in psychology, in logic and psychology, which of course on MINDSHOCK, the only thing we know for sure is that we don't know anything for sure. Again, humans are not perfect, but there are certain basic definitions that are empirically verifiable. Just crack open that dictionary or go to an online dictionary. It's not rocket science, people. Hope you guys enjoyed another edition of MINDSHOCK True Crime in the Stephen Avery series. If you like the podcast, you can donate to our PayPal. Just check the link in the description. Make sure you subscribe to the channel. Questions, comments, thoughts, theories, debunkings, rebuttals, leave them in the comment section. You can check us out on social media, Twitter, Reddit, Facebook, Patreon. If you like the podcast, hit the like button, share it across social media platforms. This is Bruce McGuire. Catch you guys next time.